Welcome to Sherlock's Casebook, where every mystery has a story, and every story hides a secret. Step into the world of deduction, suspense, and untold cases of Sherlock Holmes. Are you ready to uncover the truth? A perplexing crime. It was on a particularly dreary evening in October that I, Dr. John Watson, found myself seated across from my dear friend Sherlock Holmes in the familiar confines of 221B Baker Street. The gas lamps outside flickered against the London fog, their glow barely penetrating the mist that curled through the streets like the fingers of some unseen phantom. Holmes, for his part, appeared as detached as ever, idly plucking at the strings of his violin, his gaze fixed upon the ceiling in a trance of contemplation. We had seen little in the way of stimulating cases that week, and I could tell by the restless way in which Holmes toyed with his bow that he was growing impatient. It was in such moments that he often turned to the darker recesses of his mind, indulging in a 7% solution of cocaine to stave off the unbearable monotony of inaction. I had resolved to speak with him about it when the sound of hurried footsteps upon the stairs broke the silence, followed by a firm rapping at the door. Holmes sat up immediately, his eyes alight with sudden interest. "Come in," he called. The door swung open, revealing a man of short stature, his face pale with distress. He was clad in a fine but somewhat dishevelled suit, his cravat loose as though hastily tied. His hands trembled as he removed his hat, revealing thinning auburn hair that seemed damp with sweat. I beg your pardon, Mr. Holmes," he stammered, his voice carrying the weight of some unseen burden. "My name is Mr. Alfred Linden. I fear I am in desperate need of your assistance." Holmes regarded him with a piercing gaze, his sharp eyes flitting over the man's figure with an intensity that suggested he had already drawn several conclusions about our visitor before a single word had been spoken. "Pray, do sit down, Mr. Linden," he said smoothly, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "You are clearly a man in distress. A sleepless night, I presume, and unless I am mistaken, you have travelled here in great haste, despite the late hour. Your coat is damp from the evening mist, and there is a distinct scent of coal dust upon your gloves. You have come from the East End, perhaps?" Mr. Linden gaped at him. "Why, yes, Mr. Holmes. I reside in Whitechapel, though my business is in the city. But how could you possibly—" Holmes waved a hand dismissively. "We shall return to that later. For now, let us concern ourselves with the nature of your visit. You say you are in need of my assistance. What, pray, is the matter?" Mr. Linden hesitated for only a moment before, leaning forward, his voice lowered as though he feared being overheard. "It is my employer, Mr. Edwin Hargrave. He is dead." "Dead, you say?" Holmes steepled his fingers. "And under what circumstances?" "A most terrible one, sir," Linden replied. "He was found in his study this very evening. The door was locked from the inside, no sign of forced entry. And yet, Mr. Holmes—" He hesitated, his voice unsteady. His face, it was twisted in sheer terror, as though he had seen something unspeakable before he died. I glanced at Holmes, who sat in uncharacteristic stillness. "A locked room mystery," he murmured at last, his eyes gleaming with intrigue. "Most fascinating. Tell me, Mr. Linden, was there anything unusual about the room?" Linden swallowed hard. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. On the walls, written in his own blood, were the words, 'They whisper in the shadows.' For a long moment there was silence. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, Holmes sprang to his feet and reached for his coat. "Come, Watson," he declared. "The game is afoot." Case Introduction. The hansom cab rattled through the fog-drenched streets of London as Holmes, seated beside me, maintained a contemplative silence. Our client, Mr. Alfred Linden, sat opposite, his hands nervously wringing his hat, his gaze darting between Holmes and the swirling mist beyond the window. "You say the room was locked from within?" Holmes inquired at last, his voice calm yet probing. "Yes, Mr. Holmes," Linden replied. "We had to force the door open. And there were no other points of entry. No open windows, no secret passages. None, sir. The windows were latched. The only door was the one we found locked." Holmes nodded slightly, his fingers drumming against his knee. A locked room, a corpse bearing an expression of terror, and a cryptic message scrawled in blood. The whisper in the shadows. He turned his sharp gaze upon Linden. "Tell me, sir, had Mr. Hargrave exhibited any unusual behaviour prior to his death?" Linden hesitated. He had been unsettled these past few weeks. He claimed he was being watched. He dismissed it as paranoia at first, but he grew more and more convinced that something, or someone, was following him. "Following him?" I interjected. "Did he mention seeing anyone?" "No," Linden shook his head. "Not specifically, Doctor, but he spoke of shadows moving where none should be, of whispers in the dead of night. He even refused to be alone after sundown." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Did he confide in you the reason for this fear?" Linden hesitated, his fingers tightening around his hat. "Only once. 3 nights ago, I overheard him speaking to himself in his study. He was muttering about the price of betrayal, and how they would not forgive. When I asked him about it, he dismissed my concerns, said it was nothing but an old man's fancy." Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me before shifting his attention back to Linden. "And yet, 3 days later, he is found dead in a locked room with a message written in his own blood." He exhaled through his nose. "Fascinating." The cab jolted to a stop. Linden peered out nervously. "We have arrived." Holmes stepped out first, his keen eyes scanning the towering structure before us. Hargrave's residence was a stately Victorian townhouse, its windows dark, its silhouette framed against the dense fog. A single gas lamp flickered by the entrance, casting long, wavering shadows upon the cobblestone street. Linden led us up the steps, his hands shaking as he fumbled with his keys. The door groaned open, revealing a dimly lit hallway lined with heavy drapery. The scent of old books and cigar smoke lingered in the air. "Mr. Hargrave's study is just ahead," Linden whispered. "But I must warn you, Mr. Holmes, the sight is most disturbing." Holmes merely gave a thin smile. "Excellent. Lead the way." As we stepped forward, the door creaked shut behind us, and for a brief moment I could have sworn I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, slipping through the darkness. "Early investigation." Linden led us through the dimly lit corridor, his every step hesitant, as though he feared what lay ahead. The air inside Hargrave's residence was thick with an eerie stillness, the kind that clung to places recently touched by death. A faint ticking echoed through the hallway. the sound of a grandfather clock counting the moments since its master had drawn his last breath. At last we reached the study. Lyndon hesitated at the door, his fingers hovering over the brass handle. "Prepare yourselves, gentlemen," he murmured before pushing it open. The sight that met us was indeed most disturbing. Edwin Hargrave's body slumped against the grand mahogany desk, his face frozen in a grotesque mask of terror. His wide, unseeing eyes stared towards the ceiling, his lips parted as if he had died mid-scream. His right hand, stiff in death, had smeared a single phrase across the wallpaper in dark, drying blood. "They whisper in the shadows." A cold chill prickled at the back of my neck. The words, scrawled in uneven strokes, gave the impression of desperate finality, as though Hargrave's last moments had been spent in sheer, unrelenting horror. Holmes, however, remained unmoved. He swept into the room with the air of a man inspecting a particularly interesting puzzle. His sharp eyes darted across the study, absorbing every detail: the arrangement of the furniture, the positioning of the body, the subtle disturbances that others would overlook. He moved first to the desk, his fingers tracing its polished surface. A toppled inkwell had left dark stains upon a stack of papers, but nothing seemed otherwise out of place. Next, he crouched beside Hargrave's body, studying the peculiar way in which the man's fingers had stiffened. "A remarkable case indeed," Holmes murmured, half to himself. "Notice, Watson, the lack of any immediate sign of violence." I stepped closer, examining the corpse with a physician's eye. No gunshot wounds, no visible strangulation marks, no sign of forced trauma. I glanced at Holmes. Could it have been poison? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket, producing his magnifying lens, and leaned in to examine Hargrave's outstretched hand. "Curious," he muttered. "Do you observe the fingernails, Watson?" I crouched beside him, peering at the deceased's hands. A faint bluish tinge had settled beneath the nails. "Cyanosis," I noted. "Lack of oxygen. A sign of poisoning, perhaps, but it could also indicate an intense physiological reaction." Holmes finished for me. "Fear, Watson. Utter primal terror. It is as if this man died not from some external force, but from sheer fright." A silence settled over the room. The implications of Holmes's words were unsettling, to say the least. Could it be that Edwin Hargrave had been quite literally scared to death? Holmes rose abruptly, moving towards the bookshelves that lined the far wall. His fingers skimmed the spines of countless volumes before coming to rest on one, old leather-bound tome that had been pulled ever so slightly out of alignment with the others. He tilted it forward. There was a faint click. The sound of shifting wood followed, and to my astonishment, a narrow panel in the wall slid open, revealing a dark passage beyond. Lyndon gasped. "A hidden passageway! I had no idea." Holmes turned, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "It would seem, Mr. Lyndon, that your late employer was not as alone as he believed." As the gaslight flickered, the darkened passageway yawned before us, as if inviting us deeper into its secrets. First suspects and misdirection. A silence settled over the room as we stared into the hidden passage. The air that drifted from within was cold, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of damp stone, and something more elusive, something faintly metallic. Holmes, his expression alight with intrigue, turned to Lyndon. "You were unaware of this passage, Mr. Lyndon?" "Completely, Mr. Holmes," Lyndon exclaimed, his face pale. "I have worked for Mr. Hargrave for years, and never once did he mention a secret passage in his home." Holmes made a sound of mild amusement. "That, in itself, is quite telling. Watson, be so good as to bring the lamp closer." I stepped forward, raising the lamp so that its glow illuminated the narrow passage. The corridor beyond was lined with aged wooden panels, the floor thick with dust, except for a single path, where footprints had disturbed the settled layer. Someone had used this passage recently. Holmes crouched at the entrance, studying the prints with an intensity I had come to recognize. "Booted feet, small in size," he murmured. "A woman, perhaps. The depth of the impressions suggests haste." Lyndon blanched. "A woman? But who—" Before the question could be answered, a sound drifted from the darkness beyond the passage, soft, distant and chilling, a whisper. It was barely more than a breath, yet unmistakable. I felt my blood run cold. "Holmes, did you hear—" "Indeed, Watson." Holmes cut in, his voice steady. "A most peculiar sound." He turned sharply to Lyndon. "Who else resides in this house?" "Only the housekeeper, Mrs. Winthrop, and Mr. Hargrave's niece, Miss Eleanor Hargrave," Lyndon replied. "But neither of them, surely, they could not—" Holmes did not seem to hear him. Instead, he rose abruptly. "We shall investigate the passage soon enough, but first I must speak with the young Miss Hargrave." Lyndon swallowed. She is quite distraught, Mr. Holmes. She was the one who first discovered her uncle's body. The shock has left her in a fragile state." Holmes merely nodded. "Lead me to her." Miss Eleanor Hargrave was seated in the dimly lit drawing-room, her slender frame draped in a mourning shawl. She was a striking young woman of perhaps 20, with dark hair gathered loosely at her shoulders and wide, fearful eyes that darted toward us as we entered. "Miss Hargrave," Holmes said gently, his voice losing its usual sharpness. "I regret that we must trouble you at such a time, but I require your account of this evening's events." She shuddered. Of course, Mr. Holmes." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was retiring to my room when I heard a sound, a terrible strangled cry. I rushed to my uncle's study, but the door was locked. I pounded upon it, but there was no answer. When Mr. Lyndon arrived, he forced the door open, and we found him." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. Holmes observed her keenly. "You say you heard a cry. Did you hear anything else? Any whispers?" She lifted her tear-streaked face, confusion flickering through her expression. "Whispers, Mr. Holmes? Yes, whispers. Or perhaps the sound of movement within the walls?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No, only silence." Holmes studied her for a moment before nodding. "One final question, Miss Hargrave. Were you aware of the secret passage leading from your uncle's study?" She blinked, clearly taken aback. "A secret passage? No, Mr. Holmes, I had no idea." Holmes's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "Curious." He turned on his heel. "That will be all for now, Miss Hargrave. I suggest you rest." As we exited the drawing-room, I leaned toward Holmes. "Do you suspect her?" I murmured. "Suspect?" Holmes mused. "No, not yet. But something does not sit right, Watson. The young lady claims she knew nothing of the passage, yet her reaction when I mentioned it was not surprise, but something else entirely." "Fear?" I suggested. Holmes gave a knowing smile. "Perhaps. But fear of what, I wonder?" At that moment, a crash echoed from the study, followed by a muffled cry. Holmes spun toward the sound, eyes gleaming. "Come, Watson. It seems our unseen adversary has decided to act." The secret clue. Holmes was already in motion before the sound had fully faded, his long coat billowing as he strode swiftly toward the study. I followed close behind, my pulse quickening. The air in the house, already heavy with unease, now carried a sharp tension, as though something unseen watched from the very walls. We reached the study to find the door ajar, swinging slightly on its hinges. Holmes pushed it open fully and stepped inside. The dim gaslight flickered, casting restless shadows over the room. At first glance, nothing appeared disturbed, until my eyes landed on the bookshelf. The false panel that Holmes had revealed not minutes before was now sealed shut. Linden arrived, panting. What happened?" "Someone else is here," Holmes murmured, "and they do not wish us to explore the passage." He stepped forward, his fingers skimming the edge of the bookshelf. "Observe, Watson. The dust on the shelf is unsettled. This was not the wind or an accident. Someone, perhaps the very same person who left those footprints in the passage, has deliberately closed it." Linden let out a small gasp. "You mean to say the killer may still be inside the house?" Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead, he knelt by the bookshelf and retrieved something small from the floor. He held it up to the light. A fragment of deep red fabric, barely an inch long, caught on the wood. I peered at it. Clothing? A woman's dress, perhaps? Holmes pocketed the scrap and straightened. "Perhaps," he said noncommittally. His sharp eyes swept the study once more, landing upon the phrase still scrawled in dried blood on the wallpaper. "They whisper in the shadows." Holmes approached the message, tilting his head. "A most peculiar phrase. Tell me, Mr. Linden, did Mr. Hargrave have any known enemies?" Linden hesitated. "Not that I know of, sir. He was a reclusive man, to be sure, but I do not believe he had quarrels with anyone." Holmes hummed in thought. He lifted his magnifying glass and studied the writing intently. "And yet there is something here, something that does not belong." He straightened, his expression unreadable. "Come, Watson, we shall return to Miss Hargrave and Mrs. Winthrop." Linden frowned. "You think one of them is involved?" Holmes smiled thinly. "I think, Mr. Linden, that the truth is beginning to take shape, and it is rarely as it first appears." In the dimly lit parlour, Miss Eleanor Hargrave sat stiffly in her chair, her hands clasped in her lap. The elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Winthrop, stood nearby, her face lined with worry. "Miss Hargrave," Holmes began, his voice light, "forgive me for troubling you again, but I must ask, what dress were you wearing earlier this evening?" She blinked, clearly startled by the question. "A dark blue gown, Mr. Holmes. Why do you ask?" Holmes did not answer her immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze to Mrs. Winthrop. "And you, madam, what were you wearing?" The housekeeper frowned. "Why, my usual black wool dress, sir. Is something the matter?" Holmes reached into his pocket and withdrew the small scrap of fabric. "This was found at the entrance of the secret passage," he said. "It does not match either of your dresses. Which leads me to conclude, ladies, that there is another person in this house, someone who has remained unseen until now." A silence fell over the room. Miss Hargrave paled. "You mean to say someone else was here? That someone was watching us?" Holmes merely smiled. "Indeed, and I intend to find them." At that moment a soft creak echoed from the hallway beyond. Holmes turned sharply, his eyes alight with interest. "Ah," he murmured, "it seems our hidden guest has grown impatient." Without another word, he strode toward the door. Rising stakes. Holmes was through the doorway before I could react, moving with a swiftness that belied his usual air of calculated detachment. The hallway beyond was dim, the flickering gaslight casting restless shadows against the walls. Somewhere ahead, the faint sound of hurried footsteps broke the silence. "Quickly, Watson!" Holmes urged, striding forward with purpose. I followed, my heart pounding. The heavy stillness of the house, which had until now felt thick with mystery, had suddenly come alive with movement. Someone was trying to escape unseen. As we turned a corner, the faint rustle of fabric caught my ear. Holmes halted abruptly, his sharp gaze locking onto a darkened alcove just beyond the grand staircase. Without hesitation, he reached into his coat and produced a small pocket lantern, clicking it open with a flick of his wrist. The beam of light fell upon a figure, half hidden in the shadows. A woman. She stood frozen against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The deep red of her dress, the same shade as the fabric Holmes had found, seemed almost black in the dim light. Her face, though partially obscured by the shadows, was pale, her dark eyes wide with fear. "Who are you?" I demanded, stepping forward. The woman flinched, but before she could answer, Holmes spoke, his tone both calm and assured. "Miss Hargrave, would you care to introduce us to your guest?" Eleanor Hargrave, who had followed us from the parlour, gasped audibly. "What? I do not know this woman." Holmes studied Eleanor carefully, his sharp gaze lingering on her trembling hands. "I find that most unlikely," he murmured, "and yet let us not rely on assumptions. Madam," he continued, turning to the unknown woman, "you have gone to great lengths to remain unseen. Might I suggest the time for hiding is over?" For a moment the woman said nothing. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, as though she were weighing the risks of speaking. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "You should not have come here." The words, though spoken softly, sent an undeniable chill through the air. Holmes, ever unshaken, tilted his head slightly. "Fascinating," he murmured, "and yet here we are. Tell me, madam, do you reside in this house, or are you a visitor, like us?" The woman's lips parted, but before she could respond, a sudden crash from upstairs shattered the tense stillness. The sound of breaking glass rang through the house, followed by the unmistakable thud of something heavy hitting the floor. Eleanor let out a startled cry. Lyndon, who had just caught up to us, paled visibly. "The study!" he gasped. Holmes's expression sharpened. "Watson, with me!" We turned and sprinted back down the hall, leaving the unknown woman standing frozen in the alcove. As we reached the study, the sight that met us was more disturbing than I had anticipated. The bookshelf concealing the secret passage had been forced open once more. Books lay scattered across the floor, their pages torn and crumpled. The lamp on the desk had been knocked over, its glass shattered. But it was what lay beyond the passage that sent a prickle of unease down my spine. A second body, a man this time, his frame sprawled at the threshold of the hidden corridor. His clothes were dishevelled, his face twisted in an expression of horror. His hands, frozen in death, clutched at his throat as if he had been strangled, not by a person, but by fear itself. And on the wall beside him, scrawled in smudged, trembling handwriting, were the same chilling words. They whisper in the shadows. Holmes exhaled slowly, his gaze sweeping the scene with calculated precision. "Well, Watson," he murmured, "it appears our adversary has made their move." I swallowed, my pulse still racing. But who is this man? And what did he see that frightened him so terribly? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he knelt beside the corpse, his fingers lightly touching the fabric of the man's sleeve. He lifted something small and delicate from the folds of the coat, a single white feather. "Ah," he said softly, his lips curling into a knowing smile. "Now, the game truly begins. Holmes's strategic play." Holmes twirled the delicate white feather between his fingers, his expression betraying neither surprise nor satisfaction, only deep thought. The body of the unknown man lay sprawled before us, his features frozen, in terror, as if he had glimpsed something beyond the grasp of reason. The repeated message they whisper in the shadows loomed above him in smeared writing, a grim echo of the first crime. Lyndon swallowed audibly. Who is he?" Holmes rose fluidly, dusting his hands. "That, dear Mr. Lyndon, is precisely what we must determine. But first, I require a moment of solitude." He turned to me. "Watson, I trust you to ensure that no one disturbs this scene. I have an errand to attend to." I frowned. "At this hour? And where do you intend to go?" Holmes smiled cryptically. "To set a snare, my dear fellow. One cannot catch a fox without first laying the bait." Without another word, he strode toward the door, his movements swift and decisive. Before I could protest, he had disappeared into the dim corridors of the house, leaving me with the uneasy task of guarding the scene. Holmes returned nearly an hour later, his coat damp with mist from the fog-laden London streets. His expression, however, was one of quiet triumph. "Excellent," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "The pieces are aligning." Miss Hargrave, who had remained silent in the corner of the room, finally spoke. "Mr. Holmes, please, I beg you, what is happening in this house?" Holmes regarded her thoughtfully. "Miss Hargrave, would you say your uncle had many secrets?" She hesitated. I suppose he was a private man. But secrets? I cannot say." Holmes nodded absently. "And yet, secrets have a way of revealing themselves, often in the most dramatic fashion. He turned sharply toward Lyndon. "Mr. Lyndon, I require access to Mr. Hargrave's private correspondence. His letters, notes, anything he may have kept hidden." Lyndon wrung his hands. "Sir, with all due respect, I do not believe Mr. Lyndon is precisely the wrong approach to a case such as this. We require facts." Holmes interrupted. "Now, if you please." Reluctantly, Lyndon led Holmes to an ornate desk in the corner of the study. A few moments of searching produced a small locked drawer, which Holmes opened deftly with a thin metal tool from his coat pocket. Inside, beneath a stack of carefully arranged documents, was a single folded letter. Holmes retrieved it and unfolded the parchment with precise fingers. His eyes flicked over the words, his expression sharpening as he read. Then, without a word, he passed it to me. I took the letter and scanned its contents. "Dearest Edward, the whispers grow louder. I fear I am no longer safe within these walls. I have done as you instructed, but the shadows do not sleep. If I should disappear, know that the truth is buried where the moon cannot reach. Yours in haste, J." A cold shiver ran through me. "Holmes, what does this mean?" Holmes tapped the letter thoughtfully. "It means, Watson, that we have been looking at this case from the wrong perspective. Mr. Hargrave was not merely the victim of a crime. He was a man who knew something he was not meant to know, and it seems that knowledge has now claimed another life." Miss Hargrave clutched her shawl. "But who wrote that letter? And what do they mean by the moon cannot reach?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Ah, now, that is the riddle, is it not?" He turned to me. "Watson, you will accompany me to the garden." "The garden?" I asked, startled. "At this hour?" Holmes smiled. "I do believe our second victim had discovered something that cost him his life. And if my instincts are correct, it lies somewhere beneath our feet." With that, he strode toward the door once more. I sighed, grabbing my coat. "Holmes, must we always conduct our most dangerous business in the dead of night?" Holmes chuckled softly. "Ah, Watson, but what is a mystery without a touch of the dramatic?" And with that, we stepped into the dark. The reveal. The night air was thick with damp fog, as Holmes and I stepped out into the overgrown garden behind Hargrave Manor. The gas lamps lining the house barely pierced the gloom, leaving the vast stretch of land beyond swallowed in darkness. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel beneath our boots and the distant hoot of an owl. Holmes moved with purpose, his keen eyes scanning the ground as if searching for an invisible trail. He carried a small lantern, its flickering glow casting restless shadows against the skeletal branches of leafless trees. "You suspect something is buried here," I murmured, following his gaze. "Not something, Watson. Someone," Holmes corrected, his tone grave. "The letter spoke of the truth being buried where the moon cannot reach." A poetic turn of phrase, but a revealing one. If my deduction is correct, we are about to uncover what Mr. Hargrave and our second victim knew, and why it sealed their fates. I swallowed. And if the murderer is watching us even now? Holmes smiled thinly. Then we must ensure that we are quicker than they are. Suddenly he stopped and knelt down near a twisted old yew tree. "Here," he murmured, brushing away a layer of dead leaves and damp earth. The soil has been disturbed recently. I knelt beside him. You believe this is a grave? Only one way to find out. Holmes pulled a small spade from beneath his coat, an object I had not even realized he was carrying. Without hesitation he began to dig, his movements efficient and precise. I took up another spade from the gardener's shed nearby and joined him. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then, with a soft thunk, Holmes's spade struck something solid. He exchanged a glance with me before carefully brushing away the last layer of soil. A wooden box lay beneath, small, weathered, and unmarked. Holmes did not hesitate. He pried it open with the tip of his spade, revealing a bundle wrapped in yellowed cloth. Carefully, he unfolded the fabric, and as he did, I felt my stomach turn. Inside lay a skeletal hand. Misshapen, the bones twisted unnaturally, as though the body to which it belonged had not died peacefully. I drew in a sharp breath. Holmes, what is this? Holmes studied the remains with an eerie calm. A secret long buried, Watson, and one that someone wished to keep hidden forever. Before I could respond, a voice rang out in the darkness behind us. Step away from that box, Mr. Holmes. I turned sharply, my hand instinctively going to the revolver at my hip. Standing at the edge of the garden path, lantern in hand, was Lyndon. But he was not alone. Beside him stood the woman in red, the same mysterious figure we had encountered inside the house. Her face was set in an expression of cold determination, and in her hand, glinting in the lantern's light, was a small silver pistol. Holmes, unfazed, straightened and dusted his hands. Ah, he said lightly, I had wondered when you would make your move. Lyndon's face was taut, his eyes flicking nervously between us and the woman. You don't understand, Mr. Holmes. You should not have come here. Holmes smiled. On the contrary, Mr. Lyndon, I understand everything perfectly. He gestured toward the remains at his feet. This was the true secret of Hargrave Manor, was it not? The woman's grip on the pistol tightened. You know nothing. Holmes took a deliberate step forward, ignoring the weapon trained on him. Oh, but I do. And so does Watson. He turned to me. Tell me, Watson, what do you make of these bones? I hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing upon me. They seem unnatural, as if they were, I swallowed, as if they were deformed. Holmes nodded. Precisely, and therein lies our answer. He turned back to the woman in red. You were not merely hiding in this house, madam. You were guarding it, but not out of loyalty to Mr. Hargrave. No, this was personal, was it not? A tense silence. Then, finally, the woman spoke. You do not understand what he did, she whispered. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with fury. You do not know what that man took from me. Holmes tilted his head. Then enlighten us. She hesitated. Then, in a voice thick with emotion, she said, That man, Edward Hargrave, was my father. A stunned silence followed. I stared at her, then at the skeletal hand in the box. Holmes, however, merely sighed. Ah, and so the sins of the past come to light at last. I turned to him bewildered. Holmes, what in heaven's name is going on? He smiled faintly. Patience, Watson. All will be revealed in due course. He turned back to the woman. "Tell me, Miss Hargrave, what truly happened in this house all those years ago?" She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the pistol, and then she began to speak. "Mouth." The woman's voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, the weight of long-buried truths seemed to steady her. "My name is Eleanor Hargrave," she began. "Not Miss Hargrave, as you've come to know her, the niece, but his daughter. The daughter Edward Hargrave abandoned and sought to erase from history." A stunned silence followed. Even Lyndon, who had been standing stiffly beside her, shifted uncomfortably. "His daughter?" I murmured. "But that would mean—" "That I am the rightful heir to this house," Eleanor finished, her grip tightening on the pistol. "Not that it mattered to him. No, my father was a man of status and reputation. He could not afford the shame of an illegitimate child. He cast my mother aside before I was born, leaving us to scrape by on nothing. When she died, I came looking for him. I only wanted to know why he had thrown us away. And do you know what he did, Dr. Watson?" She laughed bitterly. "He paid me to leave, not with kindness, not with an apology, just a sum of money, as if I were a nuisance to be dealt with. But I didn't leave. I stayed in the shadows, watching him, and one day I discovered what even he had sought to keep buried." Holmes gave a small nod. "The remains," he said simply. "This skeleton, deformed as it is, it was hidden long before you arrived, wasn't it?" Eleanor's eyes burned with something fierce and painful. "Yes," she whispered. "I found the box in the garden years ago, long before my father's death. I didn't know who it belonged to then, only that he had gone to great lengths to conceal it. And so I waited, watching, searching for the truth." Holmes folded his arms. "And you discovered that this skeleton belonged to a child?" Lyndon inhaled sharply. My stomach turned. Eleanor nodded. "A child born with deformities, one that my father deemed an abomination, a secret that would stain his family name. So he disposed of it, erasing its existence as though it had never lived." I turned to Holmes in horror. "You mean to say that Edward Hargrave murdered his own child?" Holmes's expression was unreadable. "It would not be the first time that power and reputation have driven a man to monstrous deeds." Eleanor exhaled shakily. "I didn't know the full truth until recently. My father never spoke of it, but I pieced it together through whispers, old letters, and his own guilty silences. And then someone else found out." Her eyes flicked toward the skeleton in the box. "The man who was killed," I realized. "He uncovered the truth." "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "He was a journalist. He had been investigating my father's past for a book he was writing. When he came to the house, I tried to warn him. I told him to leave before it was too late. But I was too late myself." Her expression darkened. "He was murdered before he could expose what my father had done." Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then softly he said, "By whom?" Lyndon flinched. Eleanor turned to him slowly. The butler let out a long, shuddering breath. Then, lowering his gaze, he said, "I did it." I gasped. Eleanor's fingers twitched over the pistol. "You?" she whispered. "You?" Lyndon nodded grimly. "I was Edward Hargrave's most trusted man for nearly 40 years. I knew his secrets, I knew of you, Miss Eleanor, even when he wished to pretend you did not exist. And I knew what lay buried beneath this garden." He swallowed hard. "When that journalist began asking questions, I knew it would ruin the Hargrave name. It would ruin everything your father had built. So I did what I believed was necessary." He looked at Holmes, resigned. "I killed him." A heavy silence fell. The mist swirled around us, wrapping the garden in an eerie stillness. Finally, Holmes spoke. "You wrote the messages on the walls, then. They whisper in the shadows, a warning to frighten others away." Lyndon nodded. "I thought if I made it seem like some lingering curse, no one would dig any further." But the journalist wouldn't stop. He kept coming back. His voice lowered. So I silenced him. Eleanor exhaled sharply, lowering the pistol. "You fool," she whispered. "Did you think you were protecting him? You were only preserving his crimes." Lyndon closed his eyes. "I know." Holmes sighed. "Well, Mr. Lyndon, I hope you are prepared for what must come next." The butler straightened, as if finding some final shred of dignity. "Yes," he murmured, "I am." Holmes turned to Eleanor. "And you?" She blinked as if startled by the question. "This house is yours now, Miss Hargrave. The truth has finally been unearthed. What will you do with it?" She looked away, staring at the darkened windows of the house. For a long moment she was silent. Then, softly, she said, "I will let the dead rest." Holmes nodded approvingly. A wise decision. The case had reached its inevitable conclusion. All that remained now was for justice to take its course. I exhaled, suddenly feeling the weight of exhaustion settle upon me. "Well, Holmes, I dare say this is one of our darker cases." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Ah, but such is the nature of truth, Watson. It does not concern itself with comfort." He cast one last glance at the house before turning away. "Come, my friend, Scotland Yard awaits." And with that, we left the shadows behind. Outro. 2 days had passed since the Hargrave Manor case had been resolved, and yet I still found my thoughts drifting back to that shadowed estate. Truth had been unearthed, the guilty had confessed, and justice was now in motion. But a lingering chill remained, as if the echoes of the past refused to fade so easily. Holmes, however, seemed wholly unaffected by the weight of our recent adventure. He sat in his usual chair at 221B Baker Street, pipe in hand, staring into the fire with the air of a man who had already moved on to the next puzzle, awaiting his mind. Lestrade had visited that morning, confirming that Lyndon had been taken into custody. The old butler had surrendered without protest, offering no excuses for his actions. Eleanor Hargrave had also left London, choosing to retreat from the world that had cast her aside for so long. Whether she would ever return to Hargrave Manor remained unknown. I set down my newspaper with a sigh. "You know, Holmes, this case was not like the others. There was no criminal mastermind, no grand conspiracy, just a man trying to bury the sins of another." Holmes exhaled a stream of smoke. "Ah, Watson, you still view morality in such rigid terms. You wish to categorize crime into grand schemes and small tragedies. but the truth is far less accommodating. Whether it be a web of deception spun by a cunning villain, or the quiet horror of a desperate act, the result is the same. Justice must be served. I considered this for a moment, and yet I cannot help but feel that Miss Hargrave was the true victim in all of this. She spent her life in the shadows, searching for a truth that only brought her sorrow. Holmes gave a slight nod. Indeed, but is that not the fate of those who seek the truth, Watson? They must be prepared to face whatever they uncover, no matter how unpleasant. A silence stretched between us. Outside, the rain began to patter softly against the windows, casting a rhythmic lull over the room. Holmes tapped the ash from his pipe. "And what of you, Watson? Do you regret unearthing this mystery?" I hesitated, then shook my head. No, the truth, however dark, is always preferable to ignorance. Holmes smiled faintly. "Spoken like a true companion of mine." I chuckled, but before I could reply, there came a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson poked her head inside. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. He says it's urgent." Holmes perked up, his interest reignited at the prospect of a new mystery. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson." I sighed, folding my newspaper. And so, another case begins. Holmes leaned forward, his sharp eyes gleaming in the firelight. "Indeed, Watson, the game, as ever, is afoot." And with that, we stepped forward once more, towards another mystery, another secret waiting to be unravelled in the endless fog of London.